Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising in the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of nature, and in the deep gratitude for all of our ancestors whose actions and endeavors have brought us all to the present time. We're in a world of great challenge. We're in a world of crisis in almost every level. And we're also in a world of extraordinary fecundity and expressiveness. And I would say eros as the basic identity of what it means to be human in the world and with each other is undergoing radical transformation. And the most basic categories of our identity in terms of sexuality and gender are molting like the caterpillar into the chrysalis, into the butterfly, into something that is resplendent and dimensionalized and diversified, which requires of all of us, maybe for the first time, certainly in modern history, to embrace each other and embrace the rainbow of what it truly means to be human in a powerful and profound way that may be unprecedented. And this is, I think, the importance of this 3-day program on trans. It is an impulse that is rising up all around the world in the midst of all the craziness and all the contradictions and climate change and Ukraine and COVID and all the things that beset us. There's something powerful, there's something beautiful, and there's something that is fundamentally regenerative that is happening at the most basic level, I would say, of the existential reality of what it means to be human. Many people have said that the only way through this thicket that we are in is we have to create a new story. We have to create a new mythos, a new narrative that can take us to the future. And so what we're exploring today is part of that new narrative. So I'm very grateful for this program. And we'll introduce Kelsey back with us in a moment. But let us pause, as we always do, as we begin our sessions, to just breathe and just center ourselves in our bodies that are molting into new forms. And let us attune ourselves with our hearts just for a moment and feel the newness that is seeking to break through. Thank you, everyone. Now I'd like to welcome back Kelsey Pacha. He is a trans man. He is the author of a book, Trans Body, Trans Selves. He has multiple degrees, graduate degrees in religion and psychology. He has dedicated himself for nearly 20 years to explore and I would say elucidate the extraordinary foment that's happening in the domain of human sexuality and gender. He's the convener of this 3-day program. So Kelsey, thank you. Your session yesterday was extraordinary, I would say. So we're deeply grateful, and I welcome you back to Humanity Rising and turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim, and good morning, everyone. I'm Kelsey Pacha. I really appreciate being with many of you again today, and for any new folks, hello, it's nice to meet you. I really appreciate, Jim, how you're introducing this subject and the perspective of, as we're talking about gender and many of the changes that are happening within our society and our world around gender, gender identity expression, all of the words that we use to identify that, I too see this as, part of human evolution. And so today and tomorrow, that's the perspective that I'm coming from, that this is an opportunity for us to learn about one another, but also about ourselves. All of us have a gender. All of us have words like gender pronouns that we use to refer to ourselves and ask others to refer to us to reflect who we are in a deeply held sense. And so yesterday we talked about some foundations, some basics for how we understand what gender is. We talked about 3 dimensions of gender: sex assigned at birth, gender expression, and gender identity. Today we are shifting our focus a little bit to talk about pronouns. So words like he, she, they, ze, many others that we want people to use to refer to ourselves in the third person. So we're going to define some terms that are related to gender pronouns and talk about this from a grammatical, a social, and a legal perspective, very briefly on the legal perspective, as to why it's important for us to be nimble about how we might ask someone about their pronouns, how we might introduce our pronouns, and to give you some historical context as to how the English language in particular has developed in terms of these words that replace people's names. So many folks sort of view this conversation about pronouns as being this newfangled thing that the kids are doing. And in some ways, there is a lot of newness with how our language is developing. And at the same time, this conversation goes back to at least the 1300s in terms of linguists and philosophers trying to find words that go beyond he and she to refer to a singular person in English. Unfortunately, Dennis Baron, who is the author of a fantastic book called What is Your Pronoun Beyond He and She, was supposed to be here today, but he had an emergency where he needed to travel suddenly. And so instead, I am going to be showing a portion of an interview that he did at the Kansas City Public Library, where he talks a little bit about this history, and then we'll be referring back to some of his work throughout the presentation. So I just put in the chat for the folks that are live, that's a link to Dennis's book. If you're a grammar nerd, if you like to know about linguistics and history, it's a very interesting read. Lots and lots and lots of just amazing information that I think has been lost throughout time. Lots of literary references and looking at kind of the sociology of what are all of the reasons why we might want words other than he or she in English, and how is that connected to equity for women and for people of other genders. So just a little bit about me again. So I am a transgender man, so I was assigned female at birth, identify as male. These 2 images show me in different gender incarnations in my life. I have worked with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning people for 16 plus years, from as young as 3 years old all the way up to supporting people in their 80s. I've been a case manager for LGBTQ people. I've been a pastoral counselor. I've led lots of groups. And then I've done a lot of training and consulting for schools, for law firms, corporations, faith communities, and all of the people in between. I am the current board president of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. I wish I could say I was the author, but I'm the author of the Religion Chapter for the second edition. It's a really fantastic book. I encourage you to check it out. It's releasing on April 15th. So there are probably going to be a lot of kind of interviews and a lot of press that we'll be doing for that. But this book is a really good resource written by and for transgender, non-binary, and gender expansive people. Think about if you can remember what those words mean from yesterday. And so I bring an academic perspective, certainly, to what we're talking about today. I'm a little bit of a grammar nerd. I bring a personal perspective of having experimented with some different pronouns. And then, to be honest, even with I've been out as a trans man for, 10 years now, and I have passed as male, meaning that people see me reliably as male in society for almost 10 years as well. But some of my family members who are very supportive, very loving, still call me she occasionally, which might seem a little bit confusing. And it is jarring, especially when it happens in like public spaces. And so there's a real power, right, to our words. There's a real world impact, let's say, of someone calling me she in public, which I'll share some of those stories with you. So today is maybe an introductory conversation of how can I be more nimble? How can I practice and sort of train my brain to have a little bit more plasticity when, if you've been raised, I'm going to keep our conversation limited to folks that have been raised speaking English as their primary language. It's really easy to stay in those binary categories. So how can we practice and inform ourselves to do better? In terms of setting the stage for the conversation we're going to be having, as I mentioned, this conversation has three parts. The first is grammar. So pronouns are a part of speech. So we're going to do a little bit of review for those of us that haven't been in English class lately. Most importantly, the conversation that we're having is social, though. And what I mean by that is being able to ask about people's pronouns, being able to respect people's pronouns and use them consistently, is about respecting people's identities, of course. That's the most sort of obvious answer if I were to ask you, why is this conversation important? A lot of people would say, I want to respect people for who they really are. In the same way that I want to use someone's name and pronounce it correctly and not mix people up with similar identities, right, through those microaggressions, I also want to use the correct pronoun to refer to someone. However, respecting someone's pronoun is also about safety. So what happens when we accidentally out someone as transgender? What kind of impact can that have? Finally, it's also a conversation about health. So there is research establishing that when people are misgendered through incorrect use of pronouns, that it causes physiological stress and it causes health impacts for their daily life. And then finally, this conversation is legal. And what I mean by that is I'm coming to you from unceded Ohlone land in the San Francisco Bay Area in Northern California. California has some really great and really clear laws that protect people based on their pronouns, meaning that in employment situations and for youth in schools and also in the child welfare system, that individuals must have their pronouns respected regardless of what is on their legal record. And a lot of people don't know that. So that is important for us when we are interacting with people in institutions. Just a little preview of our time together. I'm probably going to have us take a little 5-minute breather right around 9. And I'm going to give us more spaciousness to ask questions. I really flew through a lot of material yesterday. Today, I'm going to definitely make sure that we have some time for Q&A. So if you're noticing things that feel a little bit confusing that you want to return back to, let's start to do that in just about an hour. Take some notes about what feels most pressing to you. Okay, so what are pronouns? So a pronoun is a part of speech, right? Like a noun, a verb, an adjective, an adverb, etc. And a pronoun replaces a proper noun. So this could be people, places, things, ideas. There are 8 different types of pronouns. This isn't a grammar lesson, so I'm not going to belabor the point here, but you might remember, words like myself, the reflexive, who, whom, whose, that, which, what, this, that, these, those. These are all examples of pronouns that help us to refer to ideas, to previously stated sentences, right? So pronouns are a really important part of speech that help us to communicate, especially complex ideas, where we are referring to something that might be intangible. We're referring to something that all people in the conversation are aware of as an idea without having to explicitly go back and state that thing, right? So even that, right? That thing, that's a pronoun that I'm using. Right? A gender pronoun is a type of personal pronoun. So for our purposes, we're focusing on personal pronouns, which are any words we use to replace the name or title of a person. I grew up in Catholic school, and my 8th grade English teacher was a priest who made us, he had all these mnemonic devices and rhymes to get us memorized parts of speech. We had to diagram sentences and things that are considered a lost art now. But that gave me a really good understanding of these kinds of parts of speech. So maybe some of the folks in the room, so to speak, have some of that experience as well. So this is a pronoun chart from the tech company Grammarly. I've done a little bit of work with them and wrote a blog post actually about pronouns for their website. This is a chart that they use to show, and I know it's a little bit blurry, the kinds of personal pronouns in English and the forms. So we'll see some personal pronouns in the first person, right? That's I, me, mine, myself. Second person is any form of you. So I'm talking about you, yourself or yourselves. And that is both singular and plural, although there's different forms for the reflexive in those. So when we're talking about personal pronouns that are gender pronouns, we're focused on third person pronouns. Usually in the singular. So the ones that we're most familiar with are he and she and all of the forms. So we've got the objective, him and her, the possessive, his and her, reflexive, himself, herself. And then in the plural, we have they, them, theirs for third person plural. So we're referring to a group of people. As we will see, you can also use they, them, theirs as a third person singular. Many people think that that's a new phenomenon, but it's not. It's a practice that goes back to at least 1375 in a story called William and the Werewolf. And that's out of some research that Dennis Baron has done. But this is essentially for the English language, this is what the pronoun chart looks like for us. So a little bit about this history, right? And so the history that I'm referring to is in English. What has the discourse been? What has the conversation been about the pronouns that we have? So there have been many attempts to create some kind of third person singular genderless noun, meaning some kind of word that allows us to refer to a person without belying what their gender is, and without resorting to either he or she. So there are several reasons why we would want to do this. So one of them would be, let's say we are reading a mystery novel and the author is writing about the criminal, right? So the person, we're trying to figure out who the perpetrator of these crimes is. That's the whole point of reading the book. If there's a wide variety of possible suspects for the reader, it would behoove the author to obscure the gender of that person, right? So as a crime is being described, if the author has to say only he or she, they're eliminating 50% of the possible suspects for the person reading, right? So if we had some other word that we could use to refer to that person, because we don't know their name, right? We don't know anything about who they are, presumably. It makes sense to have a genderless word we could use to refer to that person, to not ruin the surprise and the point of reading the book for the person reading. There have also been philosophers and linguists who have said in languages other than English, sometimes there aren't gender pronouns, so there is no pronoun that's used to refer to a person in the third person singular. Sometimes there's one pronoun used for the entire language, regardless of gender. So it doesn't give gendered information. It just tells you this is a single person I'm talking about. And so it provides a little bit more spaciousness and reduces bias against women, because the convention within English, especially during the Middle Ages, is to use he as the default. And many of us might have even grown up with that as a convention. So if we're talking about an individual person, we might say, a man cannot live on bread alone. When we say a man, we're not necessarily talking about just men, right? This is an idiom that is meant to talk about all of humanity, but man and he is viewed as the default. So that's part of why, folks want to say things like humankind rather than mankind, right? Is getting away from that patriarchal language where masculinity has been the default as a convention of English. And there are previous dialects of English, like Middle English, that had a third person singular genderless noun, but they've fallen out of use. There's a bunch of words like that we will review. So we can think about what is the convention for if we don't know someone's gender. So someone left their backpack. We don't know who the person was. How do we talk about who left their backpack, right? We could say a person left his or her backpack. However, that misses people that don't identify as he or she, and that is a real set of identities in our world. Saying something like everyone forgets blank password. So when we're talking about kind of a hypothetical, but we're including a whole group of unknown people, what do we say for that? Again, we could say everyone forgets his or her passwords. We can also say everyone forgets one's passwords. A person left one's backpack. One person left one's backpack. But it's a little bit onerous and confusing. Singular they, so a person left their backpack. Everyone forgets their passwords. It's been used colloquially for a long time, especially in hypotheticals. But for some academics, and this has come up in a lot of trainings I do, people will say, well, it's grammatically incorrect. They and them is only used for a group of people. I couldn't possibly use it for one single person. So what I'm getting at here is that this conversation, what's on this slide, that conversation has been happening for hundreds of years. Right. So this isn't something that has been talked about in the English language for the last 10 or even 20 years. We're talking about a conversation that started with philosophers, linguists, and writers back at least in the Middle Ages, if not a little bit before. So Gender pronouns are words used in the third person in English to refer to a person. And what is interesting about the English language, it's always important for us to pull back, right? So our language determines our thoughts. So the options that we have to think about ourselves and to think about other people really determines the reality that we're living in. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. Language is incredibly powerful. If we don't have words to refer accurately to ourselves or to others, that determines in some way the reality that we're living in, right? Because if we don't have a word to describe ourselves or others, then those identities or those phenomena can't really exist, right? So it's important for us to pull back, and I'm going to come back to that slide in just a moment, to thinking about, we're limiting our discussion today to the English language. As many of you might be aware, English is not the only language in use in the world, right? So English is what's called a naturally gendered language. So this blue mouth and tongue, what this means is that English, like Icelandic, Danish, Swedish, and some other languages, has pronouns that we assume reflects a person's gender identity, right? So when we use he to refer to someone, or a person says, I use he, him pronouns, we assume that person is a man or a boy. We assume that what they're telling us is, use this he word for me because I'm a man. And the same with she and her, right? So in English, third person singular pronouns are supposed to reflect a person's gender. That is not true in many other languages. So there are some genderless languages. This is the red on this image. So this includes Thai, Hungarian, Turkish, Tagalog, many other languages used in the world. And in these languages, either they don't use a singular third person pronoun like Hungarian. There just isn't a pronoun that's used to refer to a person in that way. Or like in Tagalog, the pronoun Shia is used for everyone. Doesn't matter what their gender is. Shia is the word that you use to replace a person's name and refer to them in the third person. Same with Mandarin. Ta is used for all of the people. Although, interestingly, in Mandarin, there's an attempt to put a different emphasis as you're pronouncing ta to indicate a person's gender identity, which is kind of an interesting flip from what we're talking about today. Lastly, the green mouth here, these are gendered languages. So there are also languages that naturally gender everything into masculine and feminine, or a lot of phenomena into masculine and feminine. So like romantic languages like Spanish, French, and Italian, you have to use gendered articles, right? Like law, lay, to refer to groups of people. Usually masculinity is the default. So if there's one man in a group, suddenly that group is masculine when you're talking about that group, even though that doesn't reflect reality, right? It doesn't actually tell us the genders of the people in that group. It just tells us that there's at least one man in that group. And these languages label all phenomena in terms of gender. So in French, la table is a table, and la is a feminine article that's attached to that table. So just because that is considered a feminine object, does that mean that French people think tables are women or girls or feminine? No. Right? It's a convention of the language that splits these parts of speech into masculine and feminine forms. So why am I talking about this? Because it's really important for us to remember. A lot of folks that say, well, I just don't want to use someone's correct pronoun. It's not grammatically correct. These are made up words. I would argue that, language affects reality, meaning, like I said, if you don't have a word to describe who you are, let's say the word non-binary, right? To not have a word that reflects who you authentically are, or to describe something about yourself, it means that part of you is illegible. It's invisible to others, right? So people make words to reflect the reality of the world. So language affects reality, and that it determines what we can talk about and with what specificity we can talk about something. But language also reflects reality, meaning that we use new words all the time to reflect how the world is changing. So take, for example, a word like the hashtag. 20 years ago, why would you put a string of words in front of a pound sign? It would be nonsense, right? There's no use for such a thing. But today, there are billions of dollars in the global economy caught up in hashtags. So a hashtag is really important for us to understand. Something like emojis, right? Those little pictures that you can put in text message or emails or whatnot. 20 years ago, what was an emoji? I didn't know what an emoji was. That wasn't something useful. It didn't describe something that existed yet. So language is always evolving to capture the reality of what is going on in our world. So I invite you to kind of keep that in mind when we're looking at some of these newer pronouns, such as ze, here, heres, or z's or zers. So going back to this chart, this is showing some, we could call them neopronouns, so meaning like newer pronouns, although some of them aren't that new, or just pronouns that go beyond he and she in English. So these are words that are in use that people feel more authentically reflect who they are. And these are the forms. So Z, here, here's. So we would say Z writes. Z writes a paper. I wrote about here. Here paper is excellent. Z cited Zir paper about herself. Those are the forms of the Z, here, here's pronouns. So these are reflecting the realities of people's identities. Okay, I just want to give you a little bit of context as to how important are some of these pronouns, who is using them, and how common are they? So I think I mentioned the 2015 US Trans Survey. This is the largest survey about transgender people in the US that's ever been done. They're about to do an update this summer. There's going to be even more people. It's going to be super interesting. It had 27,000 respondents. In this sample, about 30% used they, them pronouns. 2% use ze, here pronouns, and 4% use some other kind of neopronoun. So I use this word. This just means some kind of newer pronoun that is other than he, she, they, and ze, here. So out of 27,000 people, and that's underrepresenting how many transgender people actually live in the United States, estimates range from 1.4 million to maybe over 2 million people in the US identify as transgender, which can include people that identify as non-binary or agender beyond the gender binary in some way. And in my experience, though not always, folks that are using these neopronouns like they, them, ze, here, and others are folks that don't strictly identify as male or female. It's not always true, which we'll get to in a little bit, but in general, folks that use pronouns other than he and she are doing so because they don't identify as a man or a woman strictly. According to the Pew Forum, which Pew does a lot of different kinds of research, in a somewhat recent study, showed that 1 in 5 Americans know someone personally who goes by a pronoun other than he or she, and this number increases to over 30% among 18 to 29-year-olds. I think as we see some of Gen Z aging and becoming adults, we're going to see a lot of differences in that. The image that's on this slide shows some of the demographic information about folks, mostly age and how comfortable they feel with using pronouns other than he and she. As is intuitive, probably to most of us. Younger folks have a lot more comfort and experience using pronouns other than he and she, and it goes down kind of slightly. And then they also have some information about political affiliation, with Democrat or leaning Democrat folks being far more comfortable using pronouns other than he or she than those who are Republican or lean Republican. And I think given some of the anti-trans laws that have been proposed in the last couple of years, and they've been proposed, I think, exclusively by Republicans, we can kind of see how that would be the case, right? 1 in 4, so 25% of all queer and trans youth use some kind of pronoun or pronoun combination that goes beyond he or she. So binary construction of gender, meaning folks that don't identify as male or female. This can include multiple sets of pronouns. So there are folks that might use, she and they, or he, she, and they. If you've seen the new Queer Eye on Netflix, Jonathan Van Ness is non-binary, and in this last season corrects one of the participants who calls Jonathan he and says, just so you know, I identify as non-binary and I use he, she, and they interchangeably. So sort of saying, if you're gonna say he, please also say she and they to refer to me. I guess I won't go over the youth things as much. One last piece of research. So this image is from the Trevor Project. So this is showing percentages of different kinds of pronouns that LGBTQ youth are using, just showing this gray or black is the pronouns beyond the binary. There's also a grassroots, some grassroots research called the Gender Census that gets a lot of information about people and their use of pronouns. And so what we see in this basically is that there are some changes in terms of older folks actually using pronouns that go beyond he and she with more frequency than in previous years. This is the 2020 information. And showing that there can be complexities with how people want to be respected in terms of their identities. So some people want people to use a mix of different pronouns. Some people don't care what pronouns are used for them. And others might be experimenting with, like we see ze, them, zers here. I'm going to show you a chart of different kinds of neopronouns to make it more clearly what these like newer pronouns are, although again, not all of them are new. I want to round us out by talking about the health and social impacts of respecting or not respecting a person's pronouns. So in terms of youth and children, several studies have established that when queer and trans youth are respected with using their authentic name and pronouns, it reduces depressive symptoms. It reduces suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior, like harming behaviors or suicide attempts. In terms of adults, when people's pronouns are affirmed, it demonstrates respect, of course, but it also reduces depression, increases self-esteem, and supports positive regard. So a lot of this is obvious, right? You saw that image of me when I was in sort of a gender fluid space where sometimes people thought I was a man, sometimes people thought I was a woman. It's one thing for a stranger to call me she, and it's sort of like, whatever, I'm not going to correct that because we're not in important relationship. This interaction is over. I don't care. But when I was in situations where I corrected like a coworker, so there was a time before I took testosterone and passed reliably as male that I was using he pronouns. If someone like a coworker or a friend still kept saying she, and I kept correcting, no, he, I'm less likely to want to spend time with that person, right? Even if they're making an honest mistake, it feels very disrespectful, and it undermines when it happens in front of other people. It confuses other people. It compromises my safety, right? So when it's talking about positive regard, that's talking about basic connection and trust with a person, right? So it's going to be pretty hard to develop rapport if we can't get someone's pronoun correct. Furthermore, with adults, getting someone's pronoun wrong can cause negative emotional reactions. There's some evidence of physiological stress that can happen, lower academic focus for younger people, increased kind of self-stigma. And again, socially, it can cause confusion, right? It can cause compromised safety and confusion. So I just wanted to review, yesterday we talked about gender being biopsychosocial. And I mentioned, we talked about gender identity, expression, and sex assigned at birth. We spent a good amount of time here on gender expression and thinking, especially for ourselves, what kind of feedback have we gotten about our gender throughout the course of our lives? And I said gender expression is the place where we make assumptions about people's pronouns, whether we think they're a man or woman, what their gender is. And we can be wrong, right? So based on how a person looks, how they talk, how they walk, we naturally make assumptions about that. So this isn't a very good screen grab, but I invite you, there is a great, it's about a 25-minute episode of Jonathan Van Ness's show on Netflix. If you have Netflix, the show is called Getting Curious. There is an episode that I think is called What is Nonbinary, where JVN interviews, this is Alok Vaid-Menon. Alok is amazing. They have given just so many, they're a poet, they're an activist. They are so good at describing what it means for them to be non-binary. And they give some really good comments. There's kind of a round table of 4 people in this episode where they talk about what being non-binary means to them and some of the important language around those identities. It's, like I said, 25 minutes talking with some kind of like thought leaders in this area. The Two-Spirit video that I sent you yesterday, Gio, who's the person who is speaking in that video, is one of the interviewees in this episode. I highly encourage you to watch it if you've got access to Netflix. It's a really, really good kind of primer as to how does gender expression and gender nonconformity overlap with these conversations about pronouns. All right, so I've already kind of talked about this, but the importance of why we want to know people's pronouns, why we want to get good at asking about them is, number one, again, we naturally make assumptions. Our brains, if we were raised speaking English primarily, naturally want to use he or she. And so I know for me that when I was a case manager, I had a young person who changed their name multiple times, her name multiple times, and also changed her pronouns multiple times. So it was she, and then it was they, and then it was he, and then Z landed on Z her pronouns. And you can even hear it's like early in the morning, and I haven't a lot about using the correct pronouns is practice. So you can hear me messing up even now as I'm talking about this client, right? So I had a lot of trouble using Z here pronouns for this client. And I would do awkward things like say, Z's resume is on my desk. And then I'd think, okay, I wouldn't say she's resume or he's resume. Okay, what's the possessive of Z? It's here. Okay, so Z left here resume on my desk. And it would be this awkward thing where I would stumble over my words and I would pause and draw a lot of attention to the fact that I was having trouble using this person's correct pronouns. So what I did is I practiced, because this is a brain thing, right? This is brain mobility and plasticity. I would practice on my commute. I had to write case notes for this client, so I would practice. I wouldn't actually write about here, but I would write Z here, Z here, Z here, here's in a narrative about, whomever. I would talk to a friend if we were watching a TV show together. I would say, when we talk about this show, I'm going to use Z here pronouns for all the characters. That's because I need to get my brain wrapped around this idea, right? So when it comes to how do we change what we say, it really is practice. It's investing time and energy into saying and writing pronouns that we're not used to. I would start with they, them pronouns. If it feels hard for you to use singular they, them, it gets very easy. And frankly, if I'm in a situation, if I do like trainings, for example, and not everyone introduces their pronouns, I will use they, them when I talk about people if I don't know their gender pronouns. I consider that best practice. I'll also just say their name or this person, but I make it a practice to not assume what someone's pronoun is. And so I give the spaciousness for someone to correct and say, oh, you can call me she, right? Rather than saying, oh, this person's name is Carol Smith and they have long hair, therefore they must be a woman, right? I don't just ask someone about their pronouns because they're gender nonconforming. All the people use all the pronouns, no matter what they look like or what their name is. Some good practices also to make clear that we know pronoun usage is important is to put our pronouns in our email signature. So if you email folks a lot, I really appreciate it as a practice when I see someone's pronouns below their name on an email, because it makes clear to me, okay, here's how I would talk about that person if I was in like a group email. And again, just because someone's name is Carol Smith, I've known Carol Smiths who are men, right? We can't always know what someone's identity is or what their pronoun is just based on what their name is. And I get that a lot as Kelsey, right? So even when people are inquiring with me to come speak, they might call me she. And I'm like, okay, you clearly didn't look at my website or know much about me, but you're just assuming that I use she, her pronouns because you must be assuming that Kelsey is just a female's name when there's Kelsey Grammer, right? There are men who are named Kelsey as well. So it's a good practice to use our emails as a site for us to share our pronouns. Okay. Now, I said I was going to give you a chart that had some examples of pronouns that go beyond he and she and they in English. So we see he, she, they, and the various forms. So again, it's going to be subjective, objective, possessive, reflexive, and then plural possessive. So I've been using this word neopronoun, and I don't want to totally confuse you, because different like media outlets, when I send you some links and some resources, different people are using different phrases and terms to refer to pronouns that go beyond he and she in English. So one of them is neopronouns, neo, the prefix meaning new. So this is suggesting that these words are newer in English, and some of them are, but some of them have quite a history. So I said before, so they, them, theirs, in terms of the research, that's the most common pronoun that folks use that goes beyond he and she. Z, here, here's is the second most common as far as we know. Z, them, zers is increasing in popularity, so with the X. And then fae, faer, faers, and am, airs, I also know folks that use those pronouns. So what's interesting here is, in terms of the history, a pronoun like per, so this was actually in some English language dictionaries in the 1800s, this per, pers, pers, perself. So per has a history that dates back more than 100 years. So this, even though we might not be familiar with this in use in our lives as we grew up, this is a word that goes back to the 1800s. AM ears. These are called the Spivak pronouns, Spivak. Spivak was a linguist, I believe, from Yale, who created these pronouns to be gender neutral, is another term that folks sometimes use to refer to pronouns that go beyond he and she in English. So this was his gender neutral pronoun. It was used, so it was proposed to kind of solve this problem of why don't we use something other than he or she. And these were used in a video game in the early 90s. It was a role-playing game where you could create your own character, your avatar, right? And there was an option to make that character gender neutral. Or, you know, we might be able to label that character non-binary. I'm not totally sure what the options were there. But instead of the game saying, you know, he or she to refer to a binary character, for the gender neutral character, it would use these AM ears pronouns. So isn't that interesting? A lot of people don't know that history, right? Unless you played that game or knew about Spivak. And then Z here and here's, I started to be aware of, like in the late 90s, some writings of trans and non-binary authors like Kate Bornstein was using Z here, here's at that time. So it's not as if this is stuff that has just been created in the last 5 years. So sometimes people say gender neutral pronouns or non-binary pronouns to refer to these kinds of words. In my perspective, it's not totally correct. I guess it's a matter of choice of what you're going to label these pronouns. I want to send you, there's a great New York Times article about neopronouns that get into the ways that our language is changing and the ways that especially young people are also starting to use pronouns that are very creative and individualized. So I know that this is a little bit confusing, so just trust I'm going to toggle us back and forth so we can review what these different terms mean. So you'll see here when I'm defining neopronouns on this slide, I'm saying that neopronouns are pronouns that might refer to people entirely without reference to their genders. And if you read that New York Times article, part of what they talk about is how there are pronouns that people are making for themselves. So there's a subset of neopronouns called noun self pronouns. So this is when a person takes some kind of word, like let's say kitten, okay, and makes that their pronoun and generates a set of forms. So like kitten, kittens, kitten self. And the person will request those pronouns for themselves. They also might use their name. So let's say, like at the bottom bullet point here, let's say a person's name is Jay. Maybe Jay will say, my pronouns are Jay, Jay's, Jay self. So if we were talking about Jay, we would say, Jay left Jay's backpack. Jay had to remind Jay self to come get it. Right? Now, if your mind is exploding, it's okay, because this is truly new. This is something that's emerged only in the past few years. There's a little bit of data suggesting that this is something that has proliferated during the pandemic. In that New York Times article, they've got some images of, I think a lot of them are self-portraits that have people's pronouns. So like in this image, this person, they might label them as like the prince set. So this person wants a prin, prince self as prince pronouns. Even though it might seem like this is, what do I want to say? Immature or over the top, right? what I invite you to think about here, because honestly, when I first knew about some of these newer pronouns, I thought to myself, here's another reason why people won't take trans people in respect of our pronouns seriously, right? Because I think that this kind of creativity with pronouns, it will make people angry, right? It will make people feel like you're just trying to get attention. You're one of those like snowflakes that needs all your own special words. And so if you're having that reaction, I think that's okay to like notice. And what I invite you to think about is, we just reviewed how English is a naturally gendered language, meaning again, that we assume we get gender identity information from the pronouns that someone uses. We also assume we know what someone's pronouns are by looking at them based on how we perceive their gender expression, right? In other languages, it's not true. That kind of calculus doesn't happen because in a language like Tagalog, I'm going to use Shia to refer to all the people. So I don't really have to be paying attention to what their gender is when I'm talking about them. So I invite you to think about how this kind of phenomenon might represent the way that our English language is changing, hypothetically, to refer to other aspects of that person's identity, like their interests. So in that article, they talk about like folks that might have an interest in music or in certain animals, and that's why they're choosing these noun self pronouns. So we're not getting gendered information, but we are getting information about what that person does for work, maybe, or a fandom that that person really likes. Like sometimes folks are creating a set of pronouns that are based on like anime characters or something like that, right? So I invite you to think about, what are the possibilities for the future of the English language where people can share different things about themselves that aren't their gender in their pronouns? And is it possible that through the use of these pronouns, that our brains, right, and our social interactions will change because we're not so focused on connecting someone's gender to the pronoun we're using for them? So I'm just going to pause for a minute because I know that that was a lot. Last thing at the bottom here, and I'm taking us into that exploratory realm. In that article and in some others, they also talk about people who use like emojis or other symbols as their pronoun set, which is an interesting thing because a lot of these conversations happen online. So in that article, they reference a couple different websites where like people can explore pronouns, choose their pronouns, share pronouns with other people. They talk about the use on social media of these kinds of platforms. When you think about using emojis as a pronoun set, so that works fine if we're on the internet, right? But I wouldn't say like monkey covering eyes emoji came to my office yesterday with monkey covering their eyes, reports. That's really onerous and very complicated and abstract. However, this idea of using some kind of symbol or pictorial representation to refer to oneself isn't new. It's not new in English, and it's not new. We can think about, remember Prince, when Prince was the artist formerly known as Prince, and the love symbol, the symbol right here, was how at the time the artist formerly known as Prince wanted to be referred to. So this happened in 1993. And I'm going to say Prince because later Prince did start using Prince as their name again. But in this statement that they released, it said, it's an unpronounceable symbol whose meaning has not been identified. It's all about thinking in new ways, tuning into a new frequency. And so this symbol, Prince who was going by the artist formerly known as Prince, their record label, when this, or maybe it was Prince's publicist, when this report was released, sent out floppy disks to major news outlets that had this character, so that reporters who were interviewing the artist formerly known as Prince at the time could use that symbol in print. And the history of this symbol is, you can see this is combining like the male and female symbols, right? So we've got kind of like that Venusian thing, and we've also got the arrow for like the Martian thing, and then there's this trumpet, so it's also referring to like musicality. So I just think that it's important for us to recognize this creativity around how I am referred to and how I ask other people to refer to me. It's not new. Prince was a very androgynous figure. There are some lyrics that suggest like gender play, like in I Would Die For You, Prince sings, I'm not a woman, I'm not a man, I am something that you'll never understand. So I would think about this really broadly, again, as how are we as a society becoming more creative and changing some of these conventions around how we are referring to oneself and others. Okay, I want to take just a quick like brain break. So if we can take maybe 3 minutes, and I'm going to leave up these words. What we're going to do next, and then I'm going to open it for Q&A, is I'm going to distinguish between neopronouns and gender neutral and non-binary pronouns. And then we will, I'll take some questions, and if there are no questions, I'll continue with some other content. So let's come back in about 3 minutes. Think about what's percolating for you and what you want to know more about. All right, so I'm going to jump back in, just review some last pieces. I'm putting in the chat, so unfortunately, Dennis wasn't able to join us today. I'm going to put in the chat, this is a link to an interview that it's over an hour that Dennis did at the Kansas City Public Library, where he reviews some of the history that he talks about in his book, as far as what is the history of different kinds of pronouns in English. There's some good stuff at the beginning, like I was going to show a clip around 7 minutes to around 11 minutes. And what Baron would say are that this term gender neutral pronoun refers to a specific subset of pronouns. Sorry, I need to let a cat out of this room. Pets just choose the best times to interrupt. So Baron would say that this term gender neutral pronoun, this refers to all of the attempts since at least the 1300s to create some kind of word in English other than he or she. So there have been more than 200 such terms. In Middle English, oo in the 1300s was proposed. I mentioned per, and that was the 1600s. And thon, which is a portmanteau of that one in the 1800s. So both per and thon were in English language dictionaries. I think that I mixed up per and thon a little bit ago. Per was the 1600s, thon is the 1800s. So we can see that this was defined in the dictionary as a proposed genderless pronoun of the third person. A good practice that I would recommend is to use singular they, them to refer to people when we don't know their pronouns, and to refer to like indefinite people, hypothetical people, which we often naturally do, right? So if someone leaves their cell phone at our office or at our house, but we don't know who it was, we might naturally say singular they, them in order to refer to that person because we don't know who they were. And I want you to know that Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, and other writers use singular they, them in their writings. So again, to say it's grammatically incorrect or to say that this is a new thing of using singular they, them isn't accurate. So there's this quote from Shakespeare in A Comedy of Errors where he is using singular they, them, theirs to refer to a person. So it's really about practice. And if we need to explaining, why are we using singular they, them, theirs? I will also send in the chat. It'll take me a moment. I'll probably do it when we do Q&A, but I'll send in the chat. I've got a couple of articles describing some research that shows when we use singular they, them to refer to a person who, if we haven't like asked what their gender pronoun is, that it does reduce bias, especially against women, because again, in English, the convention has been that the masculine is the default. So there's some research that I think comes out of Sweden, talking about the equivalent use of they, them in their language and the impact that it had. And there's another one that's about hiring practices and using they, them to refer to applicants. So obscuring gender, just looking at qualifications, which tends to result in more hires of women. So that feels really important to me to name. I wanted to also just elucidate when people say non-binary pronouns. So usually what folks are meaning by that is that they're assuming that people that use pronouns other than he and she identify as non-binary. And granted, that's not a horrible assumption because a lot of the research that I reviewed, like the trans survey, Gender Census, has established that people that use pronouns other than he or she do tend to identify as non-binary or gender expansive in some way, gender questioning, gender fluid in some way. However, there are also people who might use like a singular they, them pronoun, but they identify as a man or identify as a woman. So they might use pronouns that go beyond he and she, but they identify with a binary gender. So we can think about examples like, okay, this one. So can a binary woman, so a person who identifies as a woman, or a person who identifies as a man, use non-binary pronouns, these pronouns that go beyond he and she? Sure, all the people can do all the things, right? Does using one of these pronouns that goes beyond he or she mean you identify as transgender or as non-binary? No. I know a heterosexual cisgender, so meaning not a transgender woman, a heterosexual cisgender woman who uses they them because they believe that that is politically and socially important, and they feel more comfortable using those pronouns. So if they were to introduce themselves and say like, hey, here's my name, I use they them pronouns, many of us would assume like, oh, this person must be non-binary or transgender, and we would be wrong. So I know that this is adding some more kind of complications to this, but be clear that, you know, a cisgender woman can use they them pronouns. A genderqueer person could use binary pronouns like he him. We can be a non-binary person who uses he and she interchangeably and is experimenting with other pronouns. So pronoun use is just one aspect of how we might share our identities. But it doesn't mean that it's going to give us all the information that we might think it does. Lastly, I want to give you some best practices around gender pronouns. If you were with us yesterday, I think that I sent these in the chat. If not, I will send it now. But I have gotten people's pronouns wrong. I probably will continue to. What I think is important is not getting so caught up in, I need to be perfect, I can't make mistakes, I'm a bad person if I make these assumptions. It's kind of like, for me as a white person, I acknowledge that I am racist. I know that I have internalized racist and white supremacist beliefs. And so for me, it's not so much about beating myself up or trying to prevent myself from making assumptions, from perpetuating racist microaggressions. It's more about, how do I proactively take responsibility? How do I change my language? How do I really look at myself in an honest way, so that I'm accountable for how I participate in racism, right? I can't change the way that I was raised and the way that the world reinforces white people as superior. I can do that in small ways through the kind of work that I do, but I can't snap my fingers and make that change as I'm making a change. So in the same way, when it comes to respecting people based on their pronouns, it's not about doing it perfectly. Come in with the assumption that you will assume people's pronouns and that you will be wrong. Be ready to make mistakes and already have that self-compassion. Okay, so what do you do if you call somebody by the wrong pronoun and they correct you or someone else does? A lot of times what we want to do is we want to say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I would never do that to you. And actually, I didn't have my coffee today. And I thought you were someone else. And I saw you from behind. And all those things might be true, right? Really what we're trying to say is, I want to respect you. I'm so sorry this happened. Right. But when we elongate the interaction by saying like, oh my God, can you just tell me, like, I've struggled with this. You are not the first person. Can you give me a book to read or a video to watch? We're putting that person in a position of educating and taking care of us. And that's not their problem, right? When we make a mistake, all we need to do is say, I'm sorry. I meant to say they have been a joy to work with, right? We just restate what we said, we say sorry, and then we move on. I'll tell you, as someone who has had to correct people on my pronouns, that it gets really annoying when people suddenly want me to educate and to help them be a better person, when it's like, I get paid to do that. And so I will do that for a fair exchange. But like, every time someone gets my pronoun wrong, it's really not my job to like help you to feel better about it. There are lots of really good resources online. A colleague of mine, Shige, created this website called mypronouns.org. Very clear, easily accessible information. How do I ask about somebody's pronoun? What do I do if I get it wrong? Where can I watch some videos or do some further reading on this? So that's a fantastic place to start, is mypronouns.org will give you a lot of good information. If you don't realize that you made a mistake until later, maybe someone tells you, or you think back and you're like, ooh, I think I said she instead of he. Try to apologize to the person later, whether you send an email or just say, hey, last time we were together, I think that I called you by the wrong pronoun, and I'm really sorry. I just want you to know that I know that, and I'm going to do better. That's it. Instead of going into that shame spiral of like, I'm such a horrible person, why does this always happen to me? Why am I doing this? Try to have some compassion and sit with the discomfort of, I made that mistake. It feels really horrible. When I gave that quick apology, it didn't feel good enough, but I know that that's the right thing, and I just got to move on. Like, how can I be in the discomfort and just be like, well, I'm not a horrible person, but I did make a mistake and I'm going to do better. Right? The commitment to, how am I going to do better? Like, how can I practice, right? If it's a particular person in our lives, how am I going to practice and take accountability for this? Finally, what if we're in a situation where we know someone's pronoun and someone misgenders them? They use the wrong pronoun for them. If it's possible, try to model the correct pronoun in the moment and restate what the person said. So I agree, they have been a joy to work with. And there are ways that we can kind of emphasize the pronoun, or we can use nonverbal communication to let the person know, like, hey, like, this was the incorrect pronoun. If we model it, that's a subtle way to correct that lets the person know, hey, like, I'm an ally for you. I know what happened there. And it's not as direct as saying like, whoa, whoa, whoa. They use they, them pronouns. Did you not know that? Right? We don't have to be confrontational about it, but we still can provide that correction in a way that is socially legible. However, the last thing that we always want to remember is we want to be really clear on, does that person want us to correct in that moment? So are they not out to everyone in that situation? This comes up a lot with young people and like case conferences, because I work with a lot of clinicians. So maybe a kid is out to their friends and maybe one teacher at school and their therapist, but they're not out to their parents and they don't want to be. Maybe they don't want the principal to know. So it's a good idea, if someone is experimenting with different pronouns, or they're just coming out, to ask that person like, hey, if that person, used the wrong pronoun for you earlier today, would you want me to jump in and correct them or not? And the person might say, oh, like, don't worry about it. I don't care. Like, I'm not out to that person. It doesn't matter. Or the person might say like, no, please don't correct. I actually want to be the one who speaks for myself. So we want to be really clear about how that person wants to be supported by us. And all that takes is asking. And last thing that I'll say, just as a general practice, is that a lot of folks get nervous about saying the wrong thing or asking a question that's invasive. In my experience, when someone has said, hey, I've got this question for you, and I'm asking you because I want to respect you, I want to know how to best respect you, that lands better than someone asking me for information and maybe it feeling invasive or not really being sure. So if we can make clear, like, hey, I'm curious what pronouns you use. I like to ask everybody because I don't want to make assumptions. That lands differently than, hey, like, you're kind of gender nonconforming. I'm not sure what pronouns you use, if that makes sense. I will pause there and also just share with you really quickly that I have a lot of good resources about this stuff on my website, which is kelseypachaconsulting.com. So you can look at my blog. I talk about pronoun best practices, the services that I offer, different kinds of trainings for different audiences. I talk about spiritual and religious trauma and LGBTQ people on there, why gender expression matters. So if you're looking for some information like, can I ask about gender pronouns? Like, what does that look like? I invite you to go to my website and check that stuff out. You can also send me your email if you're interested in free trainings that I do. So I offer some free trainings every month, running the gamut from Gender and Pronoun 101 to talking about family acceptance, religious and spiritual trauma, more corporate stuff. So if you're interested in that, you can join my mailing list at the bottom of my homepage. It's free trainings. I don't spam you. I just give you info. So we've got a couple minutes to take some questions. And if we don't have questions, then I will share with you some more material.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. This has been brilliant. You are amazing, my friend. And Kurt Kruger just said something that I think is really important, that you've manifested such clarity, but without any negative, accusatory, defensive emotion. You're just laying out very objectively what's going on in the world in a very supportive, encouraging, and non-judgmental way. And I just want to acknowledge that. And it made me remember back to my Harvard days in the mid 70s. I can still remember in a class where several of the women stood up and challenged the professor about his use of the male pronoun. Man shall not live by bread alone, as it says in the Gospels, etc. And he became very defensive, and this is what the Bible says, and there were demonstrations and a lot of discussion and so forth. And I remember having never thought that thought before, but as soon as I heard it, I knew they were right. And today, hearing your history and realizing that we may be going into a world in which every human being expresses freely in their own idiosyncratic way who they are and how they want to be identified. It's quite a remarkable journey over the last 50 years from the straitjacket of traditional patriarchally informed language to the plethora of self-expression and audacity, I would say, the audacity of the human spirit to break out of the box at this moment. And you've laid that out really well, Kelsey. So I just want to thank you and just acknowledge that on behalf of all of us.
And I would say too, so I want to just review 2 slides really quickly because I just forgot to mention this. Some people don't know that there's an honorific that is considered gender neutral, which is called mix. So instead of Mr. or Mrs. or Ms., the gender neutral version is mix. And Jim, you reminded me of this because growing up, okay, so I'll say this. So I was interviewed with Dennis on a radio show last year. So that's kind of how I got connected to him. But he talks about in his book how Ms. in the late 60s, early 70s, when that was proposed, as a way for maybe unmarried women, but maybe married women who wanted to not be referred to with their husband's name, wanted to be known as, that there was a big controversy and people said, this will never catch on and this is going to destroy the fabric of society and the family. It was very controversial.
I remember.
I grew up, right, in the 80s thinking like, well, Ms. is an obvious word we need that must have already been around. And I think it speaks to that, right, that oftentimes with some of these changing, like gender is a very basic social category. So I think that's why people get so threatened and afraid and freaked out with these changes in language. So for me, I think it's helpful to look back in history and recognize like even conversations about trans people in sports and stuff like that. There is such a history of rhetoric and fear about women competing in athletics, especially at the beginning of the 1900s, of like, if women play sports, they can't be good mothers, and they'll be hyper masculine, and they'll never be married, and women won't be women anymore. And that didn't happen, right? We know that. And so I think it's helpful to just look back at history and recognize this is a basic human category. This brings out a lot of triggers and angst for people who are so afraid of society changing. And that is related even to simple words like these honorifics. Other interesting thing, because I've flown just a few times recently, is that airlines like United and Southwest are offering the mix honorific as an option that passengers can choose to describe themselves. And so, just so you know, from a law and policy-based perspective, we are moving towards a place where, for example, there will be a non-binary designation federally. There already is in a few states like California, Colorado, Vermont, some others. So an X designation rather than M or F for gender. But also that's coming, at least for passports. So it'll be really interesting to see how our institutions change, because I've done a bunch of name and gender changes as part of my work with clients. Last thing I want to mention, because I didn't mention the legal part, if you live in California, you are working at a company or you have employees, it's really important to know that people must be respected by calling them by their correct pronoun and their correct name, regardless of what their legal name or their legal gender designation is. So this law was passed back in, this says 2017, but I think that this happened 2012, 2013. So just because someone has a different legal name or gender on their legal paperwork, they must be respected in their authentic gender identity, allowed to use the restrooms and the spaces that conform to that identity. And it's not as if like someone will get sued or fired if they make a mistake in someone's pronoun. But in cases where there has been a willful choice to disrespect someone's pronouns or to use the name that's incorrect, there have been lawsuits brought, whether it's in school districts or in companies. So this is more of the stick approach than the carrot approach. But if you know someone who's kind of struggling with this, in California at least, the law states you must attempt to respect someone's authentic pronouns, and it's a legal matter. So that's important for us to recognize as well. Okay, and then I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. I really appreciate this. Brings us to the end of our time. But you know, Crystal just made a comment that relationships and getting to know one another take time. And there's no shortcuts. And this may be one of the unintended consequences of COVID and the pandemic, that we've had to slow down. And as we've had to slow down, expressions like you've been describing have flourished. So I think, Crystal, thank you for making that comment. That's a very insightful one for us to just contemplate. You know, when we go through these amazing journeys like COVID, we don't really understand until we look backwards on an event often what the true consequences have been that endure over time. So Kelsey, just quickly tell us what's going to happen tomorrow.
Okay, so tomorrow is the day of what is it to be transgender, non-binary in our own words. So I'll be interviewing at least 2 other folks that are within the trans community. We'll talk about how our identities come together, what's important to us, and also answer some of your questions.
Well done, my friend. Very impressive, I must say. You know, and we've had over 400 sessions, and this has been just captivating for me, and I think for everybody involved. So thank you very much. We look forward to your final session tomorrow on the world of trans. That'll do it for us, everyone. You're welcome to the after chat session. You'll see the link in the chat box. Same time, same station. Bye for now.